The next thing I'd like for us to do is to create the bubbles inside the candy. So the candy usually has some bubbles that are scattered inside. So to create that, we're going to make use of geometry nodes. So before we actually make use of the geometry nodes, we need to duplicate this mesh for the candy. So I'll hit Shift D, and once I hit Shift D, there's going to be a duplicate. So here you can see ring candy.001. So I'll rename it. I'll call it candy bubbles. Then I can hit Z, go to wireframe, and hit the tab key when the bubbles are selected. Then I can hit A to select everything, then S to scale this down, then accept. So you're just scaling it down a bit so that any bubbles that we create, they'll not be peeking out of the candy. So I can hit tab to exit out of the edit mode. Then I can click on the backslash to isolate the mesh that's going to have the bubbles. Then I'll go back to solid. Now I'll change the editor here from timeline to geometry nodes. So on the top left of this window, click on the editors option and then go to the geometry node editor. Then we can go to the modifiers for this particular candy mesh, and then we can get rid of the modifiers that we have, the bevel and the subdivision. This looks a bit strange, but that's because we have shade smooth on. So I can select this, right click and choose shade flat. Then we can go to add modifier, and then we can choose geometry nodes. Then we can click on new. Once we click on new, we should see something here. So I'll click on new, and then we're going to see our two nodes, our group input and our group output. So our group input is the default result that we're feeding in. So the mesh that we can see here, the group output shows the final result. So I'll start by doing a simple thing, which is distributing creating a volume first. Then we're going to use that volume to distribute points. Then those points are going to be used to be used as a guide to place our bubbles. But of course, you don't need to use geometry nodes if you don't want to. Normally you'd say you duplicate all of the bubbles that you like. That's also something you could do, but I prefer this method because it is more procedural, more manageable. So this is going to allow us to have full control, and we're not going to manually have to change things, which is why geometry nodes are more useful in this context. So I'll hit Shift A, then I will search for mesh to volume. Then I'll just hover this node where we have this green line, and then I'll click. The software will connect the node automatically between the two group nodes. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make a few changes to this, because currently we can't see anything. So in this mesh to volume node, I'm going to change the density. Because we're working in real life scale, this density of 1 is quite small. So I'll use a value of 2 million. And then I will change the resolution mode from amount to size. And then I'll change the voxel size from 0.3 meters to 0.0001 meters. So then we have our volume. Then I want to have points be created and distributed within this mesh. For that to be possible, we're going to use a node called distribute points in volume. So I'll hit Shift A, then I'll search for distribute points in volume. So I'll click on this and connect it after mesh to volume. This is what we have, right? Then the next thing that I'd like for us to do is now to have these points, because whatever we are seeing are placeholders for the points. But because you're working in real scale, that's why they're so huge, because by default the scale that is being used is, again, quite huge. So I'll hit Shift A and I'll look for a node called instance on points. So instance on points is going to allow us to kind of determine what kind of objects do we want to be placed on these points that have been created. So I'll connect and you'll see nothing happens. Now whatever we're seeing has disappeared. So in the distribute points in volume node, I'll change the density to something like 20, right? Then we need an instance. So all of these, if you notice these inputs, we are all working with geometry because they're all green. So again, with the instance, we need also geometry. So I'll hit Shift A and then I'll search for a sphere. And you can use a UV sphere, an icosphere. So I think I'll use a UV sphere. Then I'll reduce the segments maybe to 12, the rings maybe to 8, and the radius, let's say 0.1. Then I'll connect this mesh to instance. Then notice we have so many spheres. So I'll reduce the radius further. So maybe 0.05. No, 0.005. Yeah, so now it works, as you can see, right? So far, we introduced a mesh to volume node that converted our mesh to a volume. Then we made changes to the density. Because we're working in real life scale, the density has to be really high. We also made adjustments to the voxel size, and in terms of the resolution mode, we're using size instead of mount. Because I found size works best compared to amount for this. Then we have the next node, which is distribute points in volume. This node takes this volume and then it kind of creates points inside it. And the density determines the number of points that you have. So if you say 20, you have 20 points. If I say 30 points, right? And then we have the instance on points. This node controls what type of mesh is going to be placed on those points that have been created, right? So it could, in some instances, not be points. It could be, or rather, in some instances, the instance can not only be one particular object like this one. It can be a collection, and that's why we have the option for pick instance and that and all that. Because if you have a collection of like 10, 20 things, you can tell it to pick automatically. So in our case, we're just making use of one. And if I zoom in, you'll see that the resolution is determined by the segments that I've set. So if I increase this, it's going to increase here. So I'll keep it quite low, 12 and 8. The radius is also quite low, 0.0005. So we have our instance, but we're not done yet. So this instance on points kind of helps you to kind of distribute the mesh or whichever object you want to be placed on the points that you've been creating. So one thing that I'm going to do, the next thing I'm going to do is for these spheres, I want them to be smooth, right? So I'm going to add a node that's going to do that. So I'll hit Shift A, then I'll search for set shade smooth. So this one, click on it, then I'll place it after the UV sphere, and it's going to make it smooth. Because we can't select it and right click and say shade smooth, that won't work. And then the other thing is for material for the bubbles, it needs to be set in the geometry nodes. So I again need to add a node for that. So I'm going to again Shift A, then set material. So here's the set material node, connect it after set shade smooth. So at this point you might say, yeah, we're done, but we're not done. There's one thing that's remaining. If I select this and hit G, the thing that remains is the size of the spheres. All of these spheres have the same size, and I want some of them to be large, I want others to be small. So I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to type in random value, right? This random value node, I'm going to use it to affect the scale. So if you look at the instance on points node, there's rotation, there's scale. So this scale, I want it to be connected to the random value. And this scale value, if I hover over it, it says float. So that means you also need to make sure that the random value data type is float as well. Float is a number with a decimal point. An integer is a whole number. You have a boolean that's either on and off, and so on and so forth, right? So here, I want to connect this value to the scale. And because the minimum is set to 0 and the maximum is set to 1, some of these spheres are going to disappear because some of them are going to be assigned a scale of 0, sorry, that's going to make them disappear. So I'll connect and you'll see some of them, you can't be able to see them. Either they become really tiny or they disappear completely. So the minimum value, I don't want it to be set to 0. I'll set it to maybe 0.08. That's the minimum size a sphere can have. And then the maximum is 1. And then we have the seed. The seed changes whatever arrangement that is being set up scale-wise or size-wise. So I can adjust this and we get different results. Similar to the distribute points in volume, you can adjust the seed and you'll get a different organization of the bubbles. And this is basically something that you use, especially if you notice that some of these bubbles kind of intersect with the candy. So if I exit isolation mode by clicking on the backslash and then I hit Z wireframe, this is what we have. So as you can see, there's this sphere that is inside this particular extrusion. So we can adjust the seed to change that, right? But I don't think it's going to matter that much for us in this instance. So I'll leave it as is. So for the minimum, I think the minimum size of this, maybe I could set it to 0.1. Then the maximum, I could even go to 2. There's nothing that's going to stop me from having a scale of 2 because the value is available. So our geometry nodes setup is, again, we start by converting the mesh to a volume, and then we kind of want to have points distributed in the volume. Once that happens, we want those points to now have a mesh assigned to it. And for that to be possible, we're going to use an instance on points, where we're going to kind of give it the points that it needs to create copies on. And then we're also going to give it the mesh that it's going to distribute on those points. Then we're also going to randomize the scale. If we were not using spherical shapes, so let's say we were using something else, we could also use a random value to randomize the rotation as well. But in my case, I just want to randomize the scale. So that's how we create the bubbles. So if you wanted more, you would come to the density, type in, let's say 50, you'll get more bubbles. But this is a bit too much, so I'll leave it at 20. I think 20 is fine. Yeah. So that's how you create these bubbles.